From a young age, I always felt out of place. Growing up in a small town in western New York, my world felt confined, and the future seemed distant and unclear. My parents did their best. My father worked in construction, and my mother kept our home in order. I was just an average kid, blending into the background both academically and socially. College was no different. I attended a local school, staying at home to save money. My grades were unimpressive, and I often worked more than I studied, whether flipping burgers or helping my dad on construction sites. When I graduated with a business degree, I naively believed the world would open up for me. But reality hit hard. The big companies didn't want me. I didn't come from an Ivy League school, and my average grades weren't impressive. I ended up at a small property management firm where my role was far from glamorous. Yet surprisingly, this is where I discovered my passion for real estate. My boss noticed my growing interest and became my mentor, teaching me the ropes of the industry and eventually setting me on a path I hadn't anticipated. Now it was time to close this chapter and start anew. I had parked my SUV in the airport's long-term lot, estimating it would take about 2 weeks before anyone noticed it had overstayed. With just a briefcase and a small travel case, I walked toward the Delta terminal. Inside the briefcase were all the essentials, several IDs, a few $1,000s in cash, and my travel documents. To a casual observer, everything seemed normal, but anyone who truly knew me would sense something was off. The identification bore a different name, though the face on the license and passport was unmistakably mine. Today marked the beginning of my new life, under a new identity. I entered the terminal and went through the screening process to board my flight. TSA was efficient. They checked my ticket, x-rayed my briefcase, wallet, and car keys. There were no bombs, water bottles, or other prohibited items. They rightly concluded I wasn't a terrorist and let me through. My next stop was the men's room, where I entered a stall and began removing my outer clothing. Underneath, I had another outfit. I transformed from a businessman into a tourist returning from vacation, now wearing a flashy shirt, shorts, and summer shoes. I exited the restroom and blended in with passengers arriving from Las Vegas. I looked like just another tourist back from Fun City. I followed the crowd to baggage claim and approached a small, nondescript wheeled suitcase sitting alone on the conveyor. Since no one paid attention to it, I grabbed it and headed for the exit. I boarded the interterminal transport and 10 minutes later exited at another terminal. I stopped at the restroom, shed another layer of clothing, and stashed it in the stolen suitcase. At the ticket counter, I checked the bag, used one of my new IDs, and collected my boarding pass. Instead of facing the TSA checkpoint again, I headed to the area with all the shops, losing myself in the crowds before slowly making my way to the exits. Soon I was back on the tram, heading toward Continental's terminal. This time, I was actually going to board a plane and leave the airport. Soon I was on an overseas flight. I had successfully transformed into another person. My new life begins now. My wife, the cheating traitor, will never find me or my money. I suppose I should explain what led to this drastic change in my life. Let me start by telling you more about myself. I was born in western New York in 1960. I graduated from high school in the middle of my class. I wasn't particularly remarkable in academics or physical fitness. I guess you could say I was just an average kid. My parents weren't wealthy professionals. My mom stayed at home and my dad worked in construction. I attended a local college and lived at home. During the school year, I worked part-time in fast food and spent summers working construction with my dad. My college grades were mediocre, with a 2.6 GPA over 4 years. Between working long hours, I didn't focus much on school, doing just enough to get by. I graduated with a business degree and stepped out into the world, ready to make my mark. But it was a shock when none of the big companies wanted to hire me. I guess my average grades from an average college with a simple business degree didn't stand out among the superstar graduates. So I searched for a job instead of a prestigious position. Eventually, I found work with a small property management firm. I didn't get a private office with a secretary. I got a desk, a phone, and a lot of responsibilities for little pay. My college dreams of a white-collar job with 9 to 5 hours were shattered. In a small business, I quickly learned that everyone was a jack of all trades. I chased tenants for overdue rent, helped with evictions, interviewed prospective tenants, and even assisted the maintenance crew with cleaning and painting. I didn't make much money, but I learned the real estate business by doing everything. And in the process, I fell in love, not with a beautiful woman, but with the real estate industry. My boss, the owner, noticed my growing passion for the business and took me under his wing. He had a couple of adult children, but none were interested in following his path. I suppose I became the child he always wanted, someone he could pass his knowledge to. One day, he called me into his office. "Billy, take a look at these bank foreclosures and let me know which ones you think would be good investments for us," he said. "I have never done this before," I admitted. "Don't worry, I'll review your recommendations before we commit, and I'd like your results right after lunch." Lunch at his company was at 12 o'clock, and it was already almost 10 o'clock. He didn't give me much time, I thought. I skipped lunch and spent the next 3 hours studying the listings. I found a few that I thought he might like. Right at 1 o'clock, I walked into his office and presented my picks. He listened for almost an hour before interrupting. "Everything you picked is terrible," he said bluntly. "Come over here and I'll show you how it's done," he added. We spent the rest of the week going over the options. By the end, we had identified a few properties with great potential. I learned a lot that week, and I realized my humble boss was a real estate genius. He bid on 4 of our picks and won only one, a 4-family apartment building built in the early 1910s. It was in a neighborhood on the edge of an upscale area, popular with young couples and college students. The building needed a lot of work, but we bought it at a great price, and the bank provided all the construction loans, postponing mortgage payments for 6 months. Essentially, we bought the building with almost nothing down and had all the funds needed for renovations. At closing, he handed me the keys and said, "It's your project. Start tomorrow." For the next 6 months, I experienced more emotions than I thought possible. I went from highs to lows and back again. Along the way, I learned a lot about the rental business. By the time the first mortgage payment was due, I had all the apartments rented and things were running smoothly. Soon after, my boss surprised me again. "Bill, sign these papers for that 4-family building we bought." "Sure, but why?" I asked. "Because I'm transferring ownership to you. It's your building now." "What?" I exclaimed. "Bill, I'm getting old and I want to pass my knowledge on to someone. I hope you'll let me pass it to you. My kids will probably sell off all my properties when I die, as is their right. So we'll start you on your own real estate business. Please accept this small gift from me." And that's how I got started. Soon I became Bilko Properties, LLC. My friend and mentor passed away about 5 years later. Just as he predicted, his children sold everything off. They wanted top dollar and found a buyer willing to pay. By that time, I owned 15 properties, all in good areas and fully rented. My financial plan was based on 50% occupancy, meaning if half a building was rented, it covered all costs. Most of my buildings ran at 100% occupancy. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. I was doing well. I acquired a few commercial properties when the guy who bought my late boss's business went bankrupt. He thought he could hire lots of help and spend all his time on the golf course. Turns out, he was wrong. I was 30 years old when I met the woman who would become my wife. I had purchased a commercial property in a decent neighborhood, and she and a friend rented one of the office suites to start a decorating business. When they met me, I was dressed as I usually was, just like any other worker. They, however, were dressed to impress, straight out of a fashion magazine. I guess as interior decorators, they had to make an impression. Well, they certainly made one on me. Wendy was the more assertive partner, and she won my heart. In my mind, I pictured her standing in front of a vine-covered cottage with 2 small children waiting for their dad to come home. I imagined myself as that dad. When I quoted them the rent, I could tell from their faces that they couldn't afford it. "Since this building is fairly empty," I lied. "There was only one other vacancy. I could offer you an introductory rent for the first year." "How much lower?" they asked in unison. "About half. If that's not too much, the owner gives me some flexibility on introductory rates." They quickly accepted my offer and signed a 1-year lease with an option for another year, with rent to be determined later. "Can we get the owner's name and address to thank him?" Wendy asked. I gave them my mother's maiden name with a fake first name and the company's P.O. box, explaining that the owner didn't like being bothered and that a short note would be sufficient. For the next year, I helped them with all their issues. Dressed like any other worker, I watched their small business gradually grow. By the start of their second year, they renewed their lease at a higher rate, though still about 25% lower than what other tenants were paying. As I mentioned before, they were both incredibly attractive. Wendy, the one I liked, informed me one day that her partner was getting married and moving to the West Coast with her new husband. Before their lease ended, she asked, "Can I get out of our lease? I don't think I can afford it with my partner leaving." "I'm not sure about breaking the lease, but I can reduce the rent back to its original level. My boss isn't fond of empty office suites." The truth was, I didn't want her to leave. Her face lit up with a big smile, and she gave me a kiss. That kiss sealed the deal. I was in love. After we parted, she gave me a different look and a special smile. That was the beginning of our relationship. 1 year later, I found myself standing at the altar taking my vows. By the time we'd been married for a year, our daughter was born. Wendy had a difficult pregnancy and delivery. Her doctor advised against having more children, so she had her tubes tied. Our sex life remained good, but her desire for it diminished. Mine didn't. Wendy shifted her focus to her business. From that point on, she never realized that I was more than just a flunky for a wealthy landlord. She started treating me with little respect, seeing herself as the primary breadwinner. I tried to tell her that I actually owned several properties, but she never gave me the chance. Whenever I began to explain, she'd say, "I don't want to hear about your work. It's boring." To keep my family together, I accepted her low opinion of me. She was still beautiful and I was just average. By enduring her put-downs, I was able to keep my beautiful wife and daughter. My daughter quickly became the love of my life. When I wasn't working on real estate deals, I spent every available moment with her. Watching that little girl grow up was my only reason to keep going. Wendy and I just drifted further apart. She was drawn away from me by her wealthy and influential clients. But I kept buying properties. Some I held on to, while others I sold quickly for a profit. I was quietly building a fortune she knew nothing about. Wendy became increasingly contemptuous and distant. Eventually, I was relegated to the spare bedroom. The reasons for my exile were my snoring, tossing and turning, keeping her awake, and, of course, smelling like a lowly worker. At first, I was allowed to visit her bed weekly, but eventually that dwindled to once a month if I was lucky. The only reason I put up with it was my daughter. If I confronted Wendy and we divorced, I knew she'd get custody, and I'd be left with the bills. I loved my daughter too much to let a selfish wife cut me out of her life. I channeled my frustration and loneliness into my real estate business, running it like a secret mission with intense passion. I created interlocking corporations, used multiple P.O. boxes, had various office fronts, and most of my employees worked out of different buildings. In my main office, it was just me and my loyal bookkeeper. Everyone else thought I was just another worker, and I never corrected their assumptions. By the time my daughter Amy was 15, I owned about $25 million in mortgage-free property and another $50 million with some mortgage debt. These were held under various corporate names at different addresses. The rents were collected in different P.O. boxes, with some of the money quietly funneled into offshore accounts to avoid taxes. I was starting to accumulate significant wealth. By now, I owned nearly 100 properties. They weren't just small apartment buildings anymore. They included large apartment complexes, strip malls, commercial office spaces, and even a shopping mall. Amy and I grew close over the years. I was the parent who was always there for her. If she had a game, I was in the stands cheering. If she was sick, I sat by her bedside, holding her hand. We spent hours together at the mall, doing the things a mother and daughter typically would, except it was me instead of her mother. Wendy was too busy with her life to bother. By then, Wendy's business was thriving. And since I never bragged or changed my lifestyle, she still saw herself as the primary breadwinner. I never corrected her because, by that point, I didn't want her to think I had money and then divorce me. Wendy viewed me as a failure living off her success, and she no longer hid her contempt. To be considered a second-class citizen in our home, I'd need a promotion. While I tolerated her attitude, I also began hiding more of my wealth offshore. When Wendy decided to trade up, I didn't want to be left penniless. Wendy's decorating business required hiring very artistic people. These guys made me uncomfortable. Wendy noticed and took pleasure in making my life difficult. Whenever I was in her office, she would make sure that gay employees were assigned to help me. These guys had a hard time keeping their hands to themselves, and Wendy enjoyed every moment of it. I didn't. This was just another way for Wendy to show her disdain for me, but I accepted her treatment to stay in the marriage and remain close to my daughter. I had become a coward.
My husband Bill was a decent guy, but he lacked ambition. I was always driven, striving to improve our lives, while Bill seemed content to hold me back. Sure, he was an average lover and the father of our only child, and he treated our daughter like a princess. He was always there for her, but he did nothing for me. I often wondered what I ever saw in him. He was just average, satisfied with a dead-end job working as a gopher for a reclusive real estate mogul. He was always nice, though. When I started my business with my friend Millie, he was basically the landlord's errand boy, and I could easily get him to bend over backward for us, securing lower rent and plenty of extras. In our second year of business, Millie and I realized we weren't meant to be partners. I was the aggressive one. If a client was male, I'd flirt and hint at possibilities to secure their business. If a client was female and curious, I'd indulge her curiosity for the sake of the deal. Millie wasn't like that. She had morals. I, on the other hand, enjoyed playing around. Eventually, Millie left for the West Coast with her boyfriend, fed up with how I treated her. She left me the business and all the assets, and I gave her nothing in return. I worried about affording the full rent on our fancy office suite without Millie's help, so I turned my charms on Bill again. I managed to secure the lower rent for another year. I kissed him for the first time as a thank you, half teasing. But after that kiss, I realized I enjoyed kissing him. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was because I hadn't had a good session with any of my lovers in over a month. I guess I was feeling a bit needy. Despite Bill's shortcomings, he was actually a pretty good lover. He was considerate, always putting me first, unlike the men I was used to, men who cared only about their own pleasure, leaving me unsatisfied. I rarely got involved with women unless it was for business, and I always made sure they were satisfied. But that was strictly business. Outside of the bedroom, though, Bill was boring. He wasn't interested in current events, popular authors, artists, or anything like that. Conversations at parties with him would fizzle out quickly because all he could talk about was real estate and bookkeeping, topics that bored my friends to end of life. I tried taking him to operas, philharmonic concerts, and plays, but I spent most of the time trying to keep him from snoring. Since I was in the decorating business, I had to attend charity events to promote myself and be seen. When I brought Bill along, he would just sit at the table and contribute nothing to the evening. He didn't even dress well. At these events, he was more of a liability than an asset. I probably should have worked on his image, but I was too busy growing my business. One day, I received an invitation to a charity event. This time, I didn't tell Bill until it was too late for him to change his plans. "Bill, I'm going to the event. Even if you can't attend, it's important for my business, and you know I'm the one responsible for our lifestyle." I argued, "But Wendy, won't it look bad if you go alone?" Bill asked. "I'll bring one of my decorators with me. He'll be visible enough that no one will mistake him for a lover." At that event, I met James, who would become my lover. I was standing at one of the bars, looking for my date, who had likely snuck off with another guy at the party, leaving me on my own. That's when this handsome man approached me. "Excuse me, but I noticed your escort has abandoned you," James said. "I'm James William Hawthorne, and I'd love to keep you company this evening if you'll let me." The first thought that crossed my mind was, God, he's gorgeous. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and seemed wealthy. I accepted his offer, and we had a fantastic time together. On the taxi ride home, I realized I was excited, and it wasn't because of Bill. It was because of James. About a week later, James called me. "Hi, Wendy. Would you like to join me for lunch? I'm thinking of redoing my office and would love your opinion." That's how it all began. Within a month, we became lovers, meeting 2 or 3 afternoons a week in different hotels. James was my lover now. I'm not saying he was better than Bill. Bill always put my pleasure first, while James never did. James treated me like I was beneath him, while Bill treated me like a queen. But being with James was thrilling, even if he used me. He pushed me to do things Bill never would have. Sometimes I was sore from everything James made me do. I was submissive and he was dominant. I couldn't refuse him anything. I grew bored with Bill's gentle loving. I craved James's control. I was entirely his. He even started bringing other men into our bed. I never wanted it to end. I decided I needed an apartment of my own, a place where James and I could spend all our free time together. So, I made a plan and put it into action. "Bill," I started, "I'm going to rent an apartment in the city. The commute between my office and this ugly farm takes too much time, almost an hour each way. I could use that time working instead. I know you love this farm, so you and Amy can stay here. There's no need to disrupt your lives." "But Wendy," Bill began, but I cut him off. "This isn't up for discussion. I've already made up my mind. I've narrowed it down to 2 choices, and I'll be moved in by the end of the month." I saw the hurt in Bill's eyes. "Don't worry, honey. I'll still be home on weekends for you and Amy." I carried out my plans. James helped me choose an upscale apartment just minutes from my office. To make Bill feel involved, I showed him the apartment and asked for his approval. Before he could respond, I said, "I knew you'd love it too. I'll use it to showcase my decorating skills." When we left the building, I noticed that the manager seemed to know Bill. I assumed they had met at one of the real estate events Bill often attended.
The day Wendy got an apartment in town to avoid the long drive from our country house, or so she claimed, I knew my marriage was over. I had suspected she was seeing someone else, but this confirmed it. Wendy never realized that I owned that apartment building, one of my more upscale properties. My manager, who saw me there, wanted to talk, but I acted like we were just acquaintances, not employer and employee. Later, he told me about my wife and her lover. My heart broke. Despite everything, I still loved Wendy, but I didn't know how to cope with this betrayal. My only option was to gather enough evidence of her infidelity and questionable character to secure custody of our child. The manager informed me that Wendy and her lover chose the apartment together, and he even filled out the application with her. They had rented it as their love nest. We decided to wire the apartment for video and audio surveillance before Wendy moved in. I had more than enough money to cover the installation, which we disguised as a new building security system. This time I made sure Wendy paid the full rent, actually a bit higher than the other units. But since her boyfriend was footing the bill, I didn't care. I ensured the lease was in our name to prevent any lawyer from arguing that the recordings I was collecting were inadmissible in court. I began compiling evidence for a divorce. With Wendy effectively moved out, my monthly visits to her bedroom ended. Although she promised to come home on weekends, she never did. When Wendy did visit Amy and me on the weekends, Amy was thrilled to have her mother around again. She was at an age where she needed a mother's presence, someone to bond with and have girl talk. I figured it was just a phase Amy was going through, so I played along. Little did I know how wrong I was. When Wendy did grace my bed with her presence, I found myself unable to perform. The images of her with her lover, the sounds of their sessions, and his degrading comments about me haunted me. I could hear her agreeing with him that I was inadequate both as a lover and as a man. "Bill, what's wrong with you?" she asked, after one failed attempt. "We haven't had sex in months, and you can't even get excited. If I didn't know better, I'd think you had a girlfriend." "I'm sorry, Wendy, but I've got too much on my mind to perform. I'll do better next time, I promise." But there was no next time. Wendy's boyfriend sent the rent checks for her apartment to a rent collection P.O. box, which eventually made their way to me. I copied them and deposited the originals in the bank. Some of you might wonder why I didn't seek revenge while he was with my wife. Don't worry, I did. The bank manager handling my company's accounts was a good friend of mine, and he was also close with the manager at my wife's lover's bank. Just for fun, we started monitoring his finances. We discovered that he was living too close to the edge, relying on the float time between deposits and withdrawals to stay afloat. His accounts were often short on cash, so if his rent check for my wife's apartment was deposited at certain times of the month, it would either bounce or cause his wife's checks to bounce. You get the picture. We started playing with his accounts. Soon, he was getting hit with return check fees and late rent charges from my company, as well as bank fees on his wife's checks that were bouncing. His wife's embarrassment grew as her checks were refused at her favorite stores, and even her friends started asking for cash when splitting lunch bills. Our plan was working perfectly. His credit rating took a hit due to all the bounced checks and fees. His credit card companies didn't close his accounts, but they lowered his credit limit to exactly what he owed, preventing him from charging anything. This also affected his wife's use of their joint cards. As you can imagine, she was furious. No woman likes her credit card being declined. I enjoyed every moment of it. Not only was he losing money to fees, but he also had to explain to his wife why their finances were in such a mess without revealing that it was due to my wife's apartment and our deposit timings. I'm sure their household finances led to some very interesting conversations. Then, fate handed me another break. Wendy visited her doctor for some female health issues, and her pap smear indicated she had a form of cancer. Our relationship had deteriorated to the point where she didn't tell me anything about it, only mentioning that she needed surgery for some female problems. The truth came out when our 17-year-old daughter, Amy, accidentally revealed the situation. She told me she was planning to stay with her mother during the ordeal. "Amy, why?" I asked. "Have I really been such a bad father to you?" "No, Dad, you haven't, but Mom needs me. She has ovarian cancer, and while you may not love her anymore, I still do. I want to help her through these next few months until she gets better. I missed my daughter, but I had to stay focused on my plans. If Amy chose to be with her mother instead of me, I had to accept it. As much as I wanted her with me, she made her decision. I figured that maybe living with her mom would eventually show Amy who her mother truly was. I went to church the following Sunday. It had been years since I set foot in a church, but I felt the need to thank God, not for Wendy's recovery, but for giving her cancer. It was the best thing that could have happened to me. Wendy was suffering, and her lover was the one paying the price, getting nothing in return. He had to deal with her vomiting, watch her hair fall out, see her waste away, turning into a shadow of her former self. I saw in one of the tapes how he treated her, leaving her in filth until he felt like helping. Amy must have noticed too, because she was the one taking care of her mother. I made an appointment with my attorney. I told him I wanted out of my marriage with no financial loss except for his fees. I also wanted him to make sure Wendy's lover's wife had all the information she needed to ruin him. My lawyer gave me the usual speech about no-fault divorce and splitting everything 50-50ths, but I had other plans. I handed over all the video and audio evidence, along with copies of the rent checks paid by Wendy's lover for her apartment and the rental application signed by him and Wendy. I instructed him to prepare everything but wait for my signal to serve it. My next step was to sell all my properties. I had to do it gradually to avoid lowering their value too much. Fortunately, the real estate market was booming, and some new firms were competing in the area. They ended up in bidding wars over my better properties, often paying more than I expected. Meanwhile, I slowly cleared out our house of personal belongings and sold it, with the closing scheduled for the day after Wendy was served. After about 6 months, I gave my lawyer the go-ahead to provide all the evidence to Wendy's lover's wife. Once she kicked him out, he moved in with Wendy and Amy. They thought they were a happy family until they realized they were broke. His wife froze all his assets, and I drained Wendy's accounts into my offshore holdings. They were left with nothing. One day, my building manager, Phil, from Wendy's apartment, left me a message. It simply said, "Check the video I'm sending you today. Your daughter is in trouble." I hadn't reviewed the surveillance footage in months, as my lawyer had assured me we had enough evidence for the divorce. But Phil's message concerned me. That afternoon, a messenger delivered the CD. The footage was in chronological order, starting about 4 months earlier. It showed Wendy's lover pilling and attacking my daughter. Amy cried for hours but didn't leave, repeatedly asking, "Why did you let this happen, Mommy?" The footage revealed more misuse and torture. I watched my daughter spiral into dependence, begging for her next fix. Soon, she was pleading with him not to hurt her. The videos from Wendy's bedroom showed her awake, listening as Amy was forced. I saw the tears in her eyes, but she did nothing to stop it. She was too controlled by him to stand up to him. By now, Amy had become a willing participant as long as the pills kept coming. The footage spanned about 4 months, and it was too late for me to save my little girl. At 4 a.m., after hours of crying, I called my attorney and left a message asking him to save Amy, to get her out of that apartment before something worse happened. I knew she was 18 now, and legally there wasn't much I could do, but I had to try. Amy was still my little girl. While my feelings for Wendy had faded, I couldn't ignore what was happening to our daughter. The next day, my lawyer returned my call. He said he'd look into helping Amy, but there wasn't much he could do since she was an adult. Later that day, he called back with more news. He told me that Amy was pregnant and claimed Wendy's lover was the father. He was making her sell her body and keeping her hooked on pills so she wouldn't resist. He also mentioned that one night, while Wendy's lover and Amy were working a hotel bar, the client turned out to be an undercover cop. Wendy's lover was arrested on charges of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, along with various prostitution and pill-related offenses. I doubted he'd escape those charges, but just in case, I sent the tapes from Wendy's apartment to the police and the local news media. The publicity from the tapes ensured that he'd never work in town again. It also gave his wife more leverage in their divorce. Meanwhile, he remained in jail awaiting trial, unable to make bail, and my daughter was also incarcerated with no money for her release. Alan, my lawyer, and I discussed Amy's situation. Alan advised leaving her in jail so she could enter a treatment program. He explained that if I bailed her out, she'd likely end up back on the streets as just another dependent. It was better to leave her where she could get help, and he could monitor her progress. Later that day, I used the video to Photoshop just the men's faces. 3 weeks later, they were found knocking to end of life in an alley behind their favorite bar. Lucky for Wendy's lover, he was in jail, or he would have joined them. One of my storefront tenants had connections to organized crime, and they owed me a favor. In the meantime, Wendy had neglected her business while undergoing treatment. A couple of her employees, with my help, started their own decorating business and took most of her clients. Her business collapsed, and her landlord, who happened to be me, evicted her from her office suite. She was broke, with no income and no health insurance. She called me, asking to be added to my policy, which I did, but it didn't cover pre-existing conditions. I had planned ahead for that. That brings me to the present. I was on a plane to South America, untraceable. I'd land in Cancun, switch identities again, and head to Europe. From there, I'd make another switch and move to a warmer location. My wife would never find me, nor would the local authorities if they connected me to the knockings. I called my lawyer, Alan. Before leaving for Australia, Alan informed me that Amy was trying to contact me, wanting to reconcile. She had somehow discovered my wealth. Alan told her I was long gone and could only be found if I wished to be. I instructed him to use my money to prepare a defense for Amy, but to leave her in jail as long as possible. She was making progress in kicking her pill habit, and I feared that if she was released, she'd relapse. Crystal meth was notoriously difficult to quit, often requiring several relapses before recovery, if the user truly wanted it. 6 months later, I called my lawyer to check on the status of my divorce. He informed me there was no need for a divorce. Wendy had lost her battle with cancer and died before it was finalized. Since we weren't divorced and she had no money, I was responsible for her medical bills. She passed away in a charity ward, alone and in pain, with no visitors. I paid her medical expenses, feeling a twinge of guilt. Despite everything, Wendy had been the love of my life. Though her actions and greed tore us apart, a small part of me still cared for her. I was out of the country, and Amy was in jail when Wendy died. There was no funeral for her. Alan said, "Her ashes are at the county coroner's office waiting for someone to claim them. If no one does, she'll be buried in an unmarked grave with other indigent persons." Alan paused, likely expecting me to offer to handle Wendy's remains. But I had no intention of doing so. She had caused me too much pain and humiliation to forgive her now. Instead, I asked about Amy. She lost the baby in the 4th month due to an STD. She's currently serving a 12-month sentence for prostitution and pill possession. However, she's in a good dependence program and seems to be making progress. "What about Wendy's lover?" I asked, though I already knew what happened to him. He died in a prison fight. Inmates don't take kindly to his kind. "Well, if Amy asks for help with her mother's arrangements, give her the money she needs. If she's clean and pill-free, support her financially until she completes her education and can stand on her own. But if she's not clean, give her just enough to OD and then bury them both in unmarked graves," I said. I know it sounds harsh, but I'd rather have my daughter dead than living as a street dependent. If she overdosed, at least she'd go without prolonged suffering. If she stayed on the streets, she'd eventually die at the hands of some pimp. I didn't want her to suffer if she couldn't overcome her dependence. But if Amy somehow knocked the odds, recovered, and stayed clean, I'd ensure she had the resources for a second chance. I had millions, so what was a little money for my daughter? Maybe, just maybe, she'd defy the odds. It was 4 years later when I stopped by town to visit Alan, my old attorney. We hadn't spoken in years, and he was retiring and closing down his practice. I wanted to wish him well in his retirement and give him a monetary gift. He had been a good friend, actually, my only friend. I was just a lonely old man, and he was the only one who seemed to care whether I lived or died. As I drove my new Bentley through town, memories flooded back, some good, some not so much. I took extra time to drive by the properties I once owned. Most of the areas where I had owned apartments had thrived over the years, and my old holdings were in good shape. My former commercial properties also seemed to have increased in value. It was a shame that divorcing Wendy had forced me to sell them and hide my wealth. I sometimes wondered if Wendy would have respected me more if she had known about all my assets. But it was too late to find out. I parked in front of my attorney's office and went inside. The building was one of the few I still owned, mainly because it housed Alan's practice. I had wanted to keep him secure so he could protect my interests. Now that he was retiring, I planned to deed the building to him as a gift, ensuring he had something for his old age. "Hi, you old scum-sucker," Alan greeted me. "Takes one to know one," I replied. We hugged and shook hands, and it was as if no time had passed. We caught up on all that had happened over the years. When we finally slowed down, he asked, "Aren't you going to ask about your daughter, Amy?" "Not really, but I bet you were going to tell me anyway." "Actually, Bill, You'd be proud of her. After she got out of jail, she enrolled in another pill rehab program and completed it. She stayed on as a counselor and kicked her dependents," Alan continued. "Whoopee," I said sarcastically, though a part of me was glad she made it. "No, really. Amy also enrolled in a social work program at the local college. She did exceptionally well, finishing the 4-year course in 3 years. She graduates next month," Alan informed me. "And you paid for it all. I took some liberties with your instructions. Also, Bill, you might want to meet your son-in-law, Frank Murphy, and your granddaughter, Vivian. The baby is nearly 7 months old and already showing a real personality. She's going to be a beauty. A real heartbreaker," I thought, just like her grandmother. Alan continued. "You also covered their expenses beyond what Frank's modest income could handle, including a nanny named Chloe. She lives in the apartment across the hall from them and pretends to be just a helpful neighbor, giving Amy time to study and Frank room to grow in his career. I finally agreed to stay in town for Amy's graduation and attend the events surrounding it. Alan managed to get us into not just the ceremony, but also the pre- and post-graduation gatherings. At one of the pre-events, I spotted my daughter and her husband. I was impressed. It had been years since I'd seen Amy, and she had inherited her mother's beauty. I always knew she had her mother's genes, but seeing her in person was striking. She looked exactly like the woman I had once loved. A wave of sadness hit me. I hadn't expected this graduation to be so emotionally challenging. I pulled Alan aside and said, "I don't want to get involved in Amy's life anymore, so don't expect me to run up and greet them. It's just too hard." "Promise me that." "I promise," he replied. The next day, Alan and I sat midway in the stands as the graduates were announced. As they crossed the stage, their families and friends cheered and applauded. When it was Amy's turn, her husband stood with their baby in his arms, and I could see his tears from where I sat. The applause for her seemed louder than for anyone else. I felt a surge of pride. When Amy reached the center of the stage, the dean stopped her. "It is with great pleasure that I present this special award to you, Amy Murphy. You have been selected by your fellow students and the faculty for this honor. Mrs. Murphy, you are being recognized for your selfless support of others. Because of you, more of your peers are graduating today than ever before. The dropout rate since you began here is nearly 0. Along with your diploma, you'll find a certificate of appreciation signed by all your classmates and the faculty. Amy, we all love you and will miss you." As she crossed the stage, she received a standing ovation. I was prouder of her in that moment than I had ever been before. My little girl had turned out well, and I was genuinely happy for her. Once the ceremony ended, I started heading back to my car, but the aisles were packed with people. As I moved with the crowd, trying to keep my head down to avoid being recognized, I saw my daughter, her husband, and my granddaughter walking up the aisle nearby. Damn, I thought, I need a hole to crawl into. But there was no escape. I was trapped. My daughter and her husband didn't notice me, but my granddaughter did. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her watching my every move, clinging to my son-in-law's neck while keeping her eyes on me. At nearly 9 months old, she seemed to have a mind of her own. In her little voice, she began chanting, "Bopa," the word many kids use for their grandfathers. She started waving her arms and kicking her feet, trying to get out of her father's grip. Amy reached over to take the baby from her husband. When she glanced at where the baby was pointing, she saw me. Unknown to me, Chloe had been showing my granddaughter pictures of me and explaining who I was. The little one had learned her lesson well. To her credit, Amy didn't scream or faint. She simply said, "Hi, Dad. Thanks for coming and supporting us all these years. Alan spilled the beans to us about a month ago, telling us about your involvement in our lives." I later learned that Alan had quietly watched over this small family for years. He also let Amy know that it was my money she had been using for her education and living expenses. Alan had been playing the role of the father I couldn't be, while still giving me credit. I smiled at her and said, "I wouldn't have missed your graduation for all the tea in China, and paying your expenses was the least I could do. After all, it was my fault for leaving you on your own." Amy's husband, clearly taken aback, stumbled over his words. He didn't know how to handle the situation. I steadied him by catching his arm, and at that moment my granddaughter grabbed my shirt and started shouting, "Bopa, you pee!" Amy spoke first. "Vivian wants you to hold her, Dad. Would you like to carry your granddaughter?" Before I could respond, I found myself holding a very excited little girl. She wrapped her arms around my neck and proudly announced to everyone nearby that I was her Bopa. I was instantly hooked. This little girl had stolen my heart. Suddenly, I was a grandfather, father, and father-in-law, all at once, and I loved every second of it. My years of loneliness seemed to fade away, and my heart began to heal. Soon, we were standing in one of the large parking lots with Alan, my attorney. "Bill, let's get in your car and head to a restaurant so you can catch up with your family. There's a lot to talk about," Alan suggested. My son-in-law, Frank, was stunned when he realized we were walking up to a Bentley Mulsanne, a $300,000 luxury car. He stopped and stared in amazement. I handed him the keys and asked, "Want to drive, son?" The grin on his face was brighter than the lights in the parking lot. I could tell he was eager to drive. We drove over to his old knock-up Ford to grab the car seat and all the necessities for traveling with a small child. I looked at the car and made a decision. Tomorrow, Frank would get his own set of keys to the Bentley. I'd get myself a new car later. As we got underway, I found myself sitting in the back next to my granddaughter, who was nestled between Amy and me. Little Vivian held onto my arm, chattering away like any typical small child. A lump formed in my throat. "Dad, we have a lot to talk about," Amy said. "I need to apologize to you. I was a stupid, selfish kid. I never realized how much it hurt you when I left to go live with Mom." "You don't need to apologize," I replied. "I'm proud of how you turned your life around and now have a wonderful family. And I understand now that you needed your mother back then, just as she needed you. I just wish both of you hadn't been taken advantage of by that James creep." "But Dad," I cut her off, "I'd like to be a part of your new life if you'll have me. I made plenty of mistakes in our relationship, and I want to make up for them." "We do have a lot to discuss," Amy said. "And I hope I never see James again. He ruined Mom with his lies and dragged me into pills. If Frank hadn't found me, I'd still be in jail or dead from an overdose. It took me 4 tries to finally kick the dependence. Frank's love helped me overcome that last hurdle. Now little Vivian is my reason for staying clean. There's so much I want to share with her as her mother." Amy cried during most of our ride, not out of sadness, but from the sense of family. It seemed she finally felt complete. We talked through dinner, the next day at their apartment, and in the days following at my hotel. For the next month, we reconciled all those years of pain and loneliness. Eventually, we both agreed that Wendy had been the root of many of our problems. Wendy had been a selfish person, focused only on her own desires. She had been beautiful on the outside, but empty inside. Yet despite everything, I still missed her. No one would ever replace her in my heart. Amy came to realize that I wasn't the villain her mother had made me out to be, but rather a man who was far greater than Wendy had ever acknowledged. At some point during our conversations, Amy looked at me and said, "You still love her, don't you, Dad?" "It still hurts when I think about how much contempt she had for me," I admitted. "But yes, I suppose a part of me still loves her. I wasn't a coward. I loved her with all my heart. But a long time ago, she hurt me deeply. I did what I had to do to protect myself from being destroyed." About 2 months into our reconciliation, my attorney dropped a bombshell. During dinner, he asked, "What do you want me to do with Wendy's ashes? They've been on a shelf in my office for a long time." The table went silent until my granddaughter said, "Want Nana?" Amy and I exchanged glances. "Dad," Amy said, "I thought since I was in jail when she died, I'd never get to say goodbye. But now that I've heard your story, I have things to say to Mom, some not very nice. Can we get her?" "Okay," I replied. "I have things to say too, but I'm not apologizing. After all the pain she caused, she deserved what I did." "Dad, I'm not blaming you. I lived with her and the man who attacked me and got me hooked on pills. They deserved what you did, and so did I. I was awful to you until I hit rock bottom in jail and started to turn my life around." Frank added, "Dad, I met her at a halfway house where she was a counselor. I was in rehab for drinking and she helped me get sober. We've been together since..." We all agreed that Vivian should have some connection to her grandmother, even if just a gravesite. It would also give Amy and me a place to vent our anger. Later, we picked up the urn from my attorney's office. I put it in the trunk of my Bentley, hoping the ride would be uncomfortable for her, as she used to get car sick. We moved to Virginia and bought a small farm outside the city. My son-in-law and I decided to raise horses and offer stabling services. Wendy's ashes were eventually buried in a family plot on the farm, alongside remains from the 1800s. We cleaned up the area and added a picket fence, leaving space for more graves. I had a headstone made for Wendy that read, "Wendy Adams, 1956 to 1995. Cancer sufferer. She will be missed by all who loved her. We all forgive you." As the years passed, I noticed my granddaughter often played near the grave. One day, I asked her why. "Grandma talks to me and helps me read," she said. "She told me she's sorry for hurting you and hopes you'll forgive her. She also asked if she can wait here until it's your turn so you can walk into the light together." A voice in my head added, "Nice try, William, but I don't get car sick anymore." I dropped to my knees and hugged Vivian. "Papa, why are you crying?" she asked.